What unfolded inside Charlie Kirk's funeral today left thousands speechless and millions online desperate for answers. From the moment the stadium filled to capacity under Super Bowl-level security, to emotional outbursts, jaw-dropping tributes, and one unexpected act of forgiveness that stopped the crowd cold, this was no ordinary memorial. The shocking details, who showed up, what was said, and what went viral worldwide, turned Kirk's farewell into a moment unlike anything America has seen before. And the truth is, you won't believe what happened inside. In the early hours of September 21st, 2025, people began pouring into Glendale, Arizona. State Farm Stadium, normally reserved for NFL games, was transformed into a vast memorial hall for one of the most polarizing and influential figures of his generation. By sunrise, thousands were already in line, many having camped out overnight. Lines stretched for blocks as families, young people, and the elderly waited patiently under the Arizona sun. Some clutched flags, others held handmade posters or wore shirts with Charlie Kirk's face. Almost everyone came dressed in red, white, and blue, creating the image of a stadium bathed in patriotic color. Security was unlike anything most mourners had ever seen. Metal detectors, bag checks, and armed officers made the entry process slow and deliberate. Attendees compared it to airport screening, but no one complained. The sense of purpose outweighed the inconvenience. This wasn't just a funeral. It felt like a moment in history. Inside, the stadium had been transformed. Giant screens flashed images of Kirk with his wife Erica and their children, bordered by enormous American flags. Between photo montages, scripture verses appeared on the screens. The stage itself was framed like a hybrid between a church altar and a political rally platform, bulletproof glass shielding the speakers. The atmosphere was not of despair, but of unity. Entire sections of the crowd spontaneously broke into hymns while waiting. Children perched on parents' shoulders. Elderly couples held hands and prayed. Strangers hugged each other, bound together by grief and the desire to be present for something monumental. For many, it was less about saying goodbye than about being part of a defining moment, one where personal mourning blended with a collective sense of history. The service began with worship music that lasted for hours. Christian artists filled the cavernous stadium with songs that blurred the line between mourning and revival. Hands lifted, voices rose, and at times the service felt less like a funeral and more like a movement gathering strength. Then came the first of the tributes, personal, raw, and unexpected. Charlie Kirk's mentor, Frank Turek, delivered a chilling account of the final moments at Utah Valley University. He described hearing the shot, rushing toward Kirk, and realizing instantly that his friend was gone. His words reframed Kirk's final seconds, not as violent, but as almost transcendent, saying it appeared as though Charlie left the world with his eyes fixed on eternity. The crowd fell into stunned silence, many openly weeping as the weight of those words settled in. Then Erica Kirk, Charlie's widow, took the stage. Her presence alone brought the crowd to its feet, and her words became the emotional center of the day. Through tears, she spoke of the unbearable pain of losing her husband, the love of her life. But in the same breath, she offered forgiveness to the man accused of killing him. Her declaration, simple but powerful, "I forgive him," brought the stadium to a standstill before erupting into a long ovation. For many, this was the most shocking and memorable moment of the entire event. Other speakers followed, from political leaders to longtime friends. Vice President J.D. Vance remembered Kirk's kindness, recalling how he treated staffers and volunteers with the same respect he gave to world leaders. Another speaker summed up the tragedy with a chilling phrase, "The gun was pointed at him, but the bullet was aimed at all of us." The words echoed, followed by cries, applause, and a surge of emotion that swept through the stadium. Yet, despite the grief, there were glimmers of hope. A spontaneous rendition of "Amazing Grace" swelled from the crowd, voices uniting in song. Families embraced, strangers prayed together, and for a brief moment, the stadium felt transformed into something sacred. It was tragedy, yes, but also testimony, a declaration that Kirk's legacy would not end with his death. After the worship and personal tributes, the tone shifted as high-profile political figures began stepping forward. The sheer presence of so many leaders gave the event the weight of a state funeral rather than a memorial for a 31-year-old activist. Cabinet members, senators, and governors filed onto the stage, each shielded behind bulletproof glass, a reminder of the very violence that had brought them there. The first speeches struck a balance between grief and defiance. One official opened by pointing out the scale of what was happening. Never before had they seen so many mourners gathered for a figure who was not a president or a military hero. The world was watching, the speaker reminded the crowd, and in that moment, the stadium seemed to hum with both sorrow and pride. Another longtime ally of Kirk described him as a warrior for country and faith, listing his roles as husband, father, mentor, and leader. Charlie ran the race, he declared, and he finished the fight. The words struck hard. They weren't just about a man's death, they were about completing a mission, as if his life had been a campaign that ended in victory rather than defeat. What stunned many was how leaders from different walks of life, some who had clashed in the past, found common ground in their grief. They praised Kirk's ability to rally young people, to give a voice to those who felt overlooked, and to spark conversations that shaped the cultural landscape. One speaker emphasized that Kirk's influence stretched far beyond politics, saying, "He lived what our founders envisioned: freedom of speech, the courage to speak truth, even when unpopular." Throughout these speeches, the crowd responded not just with tears, but with applause and chants. It was as though the stadium itself was shifting between memorial service and political rally. For many attendees, the leader's words felt like both a eulogy and a call to arms, urging them to carry forward the work Kirk had begun. And while grief hung heavy, defiance grew stronger, turning mourning into momentum. Then came the moment thousands had waited for: President Donald Trump stepping to the podium. The stadium erupted in cheers, chants, and applause as he approached, the weight of the moment magnified by bulletproof shields and Secret Service agents positioned in every corner. For a memorial, it felt more like history unfolding. Trump's speech was both tribute and rallying cry. He began by calling Kirk a great American hero and declared that his death was not just the loss of one man, but an attack on the entire nation. "The gun was pointed at him," Trump thundered, "but the bullet was aimed at all of us." The words reverberated across the stadium, drawing gasps, then roaring applause. Some attendees stood, fists raised. Others wept quietly, holding on to loved ones. He went on to promise that Kirk's name would not be forgotten. In one of the most dramatic moments, Trump announced that Kirk would be posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The crowd erupted in cheers, many visibly moved to see Kirk elevated to the nation's highest civilian honor. Yet, in typical Trump fashion, the speech moved beyond tribute. He criticized the culture of political violence, vowing to ensure justice and condemning what he described as the forces of hate that had taken Kirk's life. His words were sharp, but his tone carried both anger and resolve. He painted Kirk as immortal, a figure whose mission would outlive him and whose name would inspire generations to come. One line lingered with particular weight. Trump said, "Charlie did not hate his opponents, and that is where I disagreed with him." It was both an acknowledgement of Kirk's softer side and a stark contrast to Trump's own combative persona. The crowd laughed nervously, then applauded, understanding the gravity behind the remark. As Trump concluded, he invited Erica Kirk back onto the stage. The two embraced as the crowd roared, a symbolic moment that merged personal grief with public recognition. For many, this was the defining image of the day: a widow standing beside the president, united by loss but uplifted by the promise that Charlie Kirk's legacy would endure. If the morning had been about grief and remembrance, the afternoon shifted toward something else: resolve. Speaker after speaker urged the crowd not to let Kirk's death be the end of his work, but rather the spark that carried it further. What began as mourning was transforming into a movement. One advisor who had worked closely with Kirk told the audience they thought his voice would be silenced. They were wrong. Charlie's words live on in us. The crowd erupted into cheers, many standing to applaud. It was a moment that echoed across the stadium, an unmistakable pivot from sorrow sorrow to defiance. Others framed Kirk's passing as a rallying cry for young people. A leader described him as the torchbearer of a new generation, adding that his ideas had been planted like seeds in the hearts of millions. "This day will be remembered," the speaker said, as the day the next generation was awakened. The crowd responded with chants of Kirk's name, creating a rhythmic swell that seemed to vibrate through the stadium itself. Friends and colleagues reminded those gathered that the best way to honor Kirk wasn't with flowers or tears, but with action. They pointed to Turning Point USA, now under Erica Kirk's leadership, as the embodiment of his vision. They urged the faithful to step into leadership roles, to organize, to mentor, to continue engaging on campuses and in communities. "The fight is not over," one speaker declared. "Charlie's mission is now our mission." The energy grew so intense that for a moment, the memorial service took on the character of a political rally. Yet the grief in the air kept it balanced. It wasn't celebration, it was determination. The thousands in attendance weren't simply being asked to remember Charlie Kirk. They were being charged to become living extensions of his legacy. For many, this call to action was exactly what they needed. The pain of the loss was still fresh, but now it had been given direction. In the midst of tragedy, attendees felt the weight of a new responsibility to ensure Charlie's work did not die with him. Amidst the larger-than-life speeches and political declarations came moments of intimacy. Stories that reminded everyone Charlie Kirk was not just a movement leader, but a husband, a father, and a friend. These personal tributes cut through the spectacle and brought the focus back to the man himself. Vice President J.D. Vance, who had been a close personal friend, shared a heartfelt memory. He told the audience that Kirk had once helped him during his Senate run, not because he was a rising politician, but because he was a friend in need. "Charlie treated staffers the same way he treated presidents," Vance said. "That's the kind of man he was, humble, generous, and grounded in faith." The crowd quieted as he spoke, the words resonating far more deeply than rhetoric. Another media figure, speaking softly compared to the fiery tone of others, recalled Kirk's fearlessness rooted in faith. He described how Charlie never wavered, even in the face of hostility, because he believed in something greater than himself. "He was not defensive, and there was no hate in his heart," the speaker said, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Friends from Kirk's personal life also stepped forward with stories that revealed his humanity. One recounted how Charlie would take late-night calls from students struggling with doubt, always offering encouragement. Another remembered the countless times he would stop to talk with ordinary supporters, never brushing them off no matter how busy he was. The tributes painted a picture of a man whose impact extended far beyond politics. He was a mentor, a confidant, and someone who carried himself with consistency in public and in private. For the crowd, these stories were reminders that the loss wasn't just of a public figure. It was of a human being with warmth, flaws, humor, and kindness. By the end of these testimonies, the stadium was quiet again. Tears replaced chants. In those moments, the audience wasn't thinking about politics or movements. They were simply grieving the loss of a man whose presence had touched them in ways large and small. The tragedy felt heavier, more personal, and more real. When Erica Kirk stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere inside the stadium shifted. The political speeches and tributes had stirred the crowd, but now all eyes were on the woman who bore the deepest grief of all. Dressed in black, holding back tears, Erica walked slowly to the podium. The audience rose to their feet, giving her a standing ovation before she even spoke. For many, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The voice of the woman who had lost her husband, the man whose absence had brought them all together. Her words were halting at first, weighed down by the enormity of her loss. She described seeing her husband in the aftermath of the shooting and how the image was seared into her memory forever. Yet she also shared something remarkable. When she looked at him, she saw a faint smile on his lips, as though he had been granted peace, even in his final moments. It was, she said, a mercy from God in the midst of tragedy. Then came the moment that stunned the stadium into silence. Erica turned her attention to the young man accused of pulling the trigger and said, simply and clearly, "I forgive him." Gasps echoed through the crowd. For several long seconds there was silence. Then the audience erupted into a thunderous ovation, many weeping, many raising their hands in prayer. It was the most shocking and powerful act of the day. Forgiveness in the face of unimaginable pain. Erica went on to promise that her husband's mission would not die. As the new leader of Turning Point USA, she pledged to continue building what they had started together, and she urged the crowd to do the same. Her speech was not just an expression of grief, it was a declaration of faith and resolve. By the time she stepped down from the podium, people were visibly shaken. Some embraced strangers, others prayed aloud. The widow's words had cut through anger and despair, offering grace where no one expected it. It was the moment that transformed the service from a political gathering into something sacred. Throughout the memorial, the visuals and atmosphere told their own story. State Farm Stadium had been transformed into a shrine, its walls lined with enormous American flags and giant screens displaying images of Charlie with his family. Everywhere, symbols of faith and patriotism blended together. Attendees raised wooden crosses high above their heads. Others waved flags or held portraits of Kirk in solemn tribute. At one point, the crowd broke spontaneously into amazing grace, their voices filling the cavernous space in haunting unison. The security presence was impossible to ignore. Speakers stood behind bulletproof glass. Armed officers patrolled every corner of the stadium. Attendees passed through metal detectors and bag checks as though entering an airport. For some, it was unnerving, but for most, it was simply necessary. A stark reminder of the violence that had brought them there. The visible precautions underscored the vulnerability many felt, even in mourning. In the concourse, merchandise tables displayed T-shirts, hats, and wristbands emblazoned with Kirk's image or slogans like, "We are Charlie." Families posed for photos near giant framed wedding portraits of Charlie and Erica, which had been placed at the stadium entrances as reminders of his personal life beyond the public stage. These small details turned the memorial into something more than a service. It was an immersive experience, part rally, part revival, part farewell. Even outside the arena, the symbols carried on. A viral video showed mourners on flights to Phoenix singing hymns together as their planes landed, while a local business delivered free food to those waiting in line. Acts of kindness that became part of the larger story. Inside and outside the stadium, it felt like a movement mourning one of its own, bound not just by grief, but by shared identity and conviction. For many who attended, the imagery will remain etched in memory. A widow's courage, a crowd singing in unison, and the sight of a stadium, usually filled with cheers of sport, transformed into a sanctuary of mourning, unity, and resolve. But beyond the viral clips, the day left an indelible impression. It was not just a funeral. It was a spectacle of faith, patriotism, grief, and resolve, blending all into something unforgettable. For Charlie Kirk's family, especially Erica, it marked both the deepest loss and the beginning of a new chapter. For his supporters, it was a reminder that legacies do not end with death. They are carried forward by those who refuse to let the mission die. As the crowd filed out under the desert sky, the echoes of hymns and applause lingered. The message was clear. Charlie Kirk was gone. But in the eyes of his followers, his story and his fight had only just begun.